We are in our latest sermon series, 10 Questions. That's short for 10 questions everyone should ask and answer about Christianity, especially teenagers. This is aimed at you. And we've been through the first 3 questions. Today we are at question 4. Can't we just be good without God? Our culture is lamenting and lifting this up quite a bit. Does being Christian make a difference as to whether or not you're any good? I think this question is expressed really well with this very short little clip from a Disney movie.
Now let's close out with the bad guy affirmation. I am bad, and that's good.
I will never be good, and that's not bad. There's no one I'd rather be than me.
This is from the movie Wreck-It Ralph, and here you have the bad guys in the video games meeting together and talking about that just because they're bad guys, that doesn't mean they're bad. And it raises a really good question that our modern, postmodern, post-Christian culture really struggles with quite a bit. What is good and evil? What's good and bad? And who gets to decide? Now you might say, well, everyone knows what's good. It's common sense, right? What does it mean to be good? Equality is good. Treating everyone fairly, treating everyone as if they matter. That's a good thing, right? How about care for the suffering? Shouldn't people who are weak or injured or feeble, they should be cared for? We all think that's a good thing, don't we? How about loving all people? Don't break people up into groups. Love everybody. Treat everyone with dignity and respect and care, all the good stuff. We want that for everybody, don't we? And also, not hurting anyone. Like, this is a no-brainer. You want to be good? Don't hurt anybody. That makes enough sense, doesn't it? We would all agree on these things. These are all good things. How about bad? Bad seems pretty common sense, too. What's bad? Racism. Thinking that because of your skin color or your ethnic background or whatever it may be, that you're some way superior to other people and they deserve less than you or to be treated in a hateful manner, to hate them because they're not like you. That's racism. That's bad. We all agree bullying is bad, right? Who likes bullies? If any of you are like, but I think bullying is good, you're probably the bully. No one likes bullies. You know how to stop a bully? You give him a knuckle sandwich, right? Isn't that the old thing? Don't do that. Bullying. We don't like bullying. How about causing war? Sometimes war is inevitable, but the real bad guys are the ones that cause the war, that make it happen. They're to be shamed beyond any reckoning of a good person. How about harming the vulnerable? Do you ever wonder why people get really upset when animals are hurt, when pets are hurt or treated poorly? It's because they're vulnerable. We don't like to see the weak get hurt. You ever heard someone say to someone, pick on someone your own size? Because we're offended by it. When animals, which are animals just do what they do, when they're harmed or when the weak are harmed in some way. It's offensive to us. It's bad. We would all agree on this, right? And it seems like it's common sense. Doesn't everyone everywhere believe this? You may be surprised that if you roll back the tape and look into history as to where our ideas of good and evil came from, that this wasn't always the case. We take for granted those values of what we consider morally good and morally bad. We take them for granted because whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, in the world that we live in the West, they seem like they would be universal. They'd be good for everybody. But if you go back to ancient Rome, we're going to roll back the tape over 2,000 years. Their values were very different. And the way that the world was very different because they don't have the same values that we do today. First of all, men were more important than women. There was not equality between men and women. In fact, women were very much just a little bit higher than slaves. And even free women were not necessarily of a higher status than male slaves. Women had no protections outside of their husband's home or their father's home. Men were just considered more important than women. Women were considered by the great philosophers as the lesser of the two sexes, of being infirm in some way, incomplete in some way. Men were just more important than women. Slavery was fine. You know, we can look at the trajectory of slavery, and all of us would agree slavery is an abhorrent evil, but what we don't realize is that up until about the 18th century, slavery was the default setting of all of humanity. And slavery still exists today. It has been overtly abolished in the West, but slavery is still active in the world, and covert slavery is still active even in places like the United States. When we hear about trafficking of people, the arguments that we have, what we're missing is that many of the people that are we don't know or are undocumented are being trafficked into lives of slavery. But in the ancient world, slavery was fine. If our army defeats your army, all of your POWs are now our slaves. If I spend good money on a person, it was completely fine for me to treat them like property. And slavery was instilled in all of the institutions of society. Martin Luther, in around the 1500s, summed up all the institutions of society or estates into three categories: the church, the family, and the state. Now, what is proclaimed in the church becomes belief in the family, and that will ultimately become practice in the state. In ancient Rome, slavery was preached by the temples as normative of how things operate. In fact, the entire world, like I said, up until the 18th century, has functioned with slavery as the norm. And not just any kind of slavery. You're also talking about the limits that marriage in our day today places on people's behavior was unknown during the time of Rome. If you were a man, you could sleep with all of your slaves and treat them however you wanted, and your wife, and there was no consequences. It wasn't frowned upon even by society. So the sexual economy was tied into slavery as a whole. The status of marriage between one man and one woman put a great limit on the power of slavery in the home and moved forward from there. It's no surprise that it took 1,800 years after Christ for slavery to be seen as abhorrent and against it. But make no mistake, slavery is not the norm today because of Jesus. Now, third, children and babies were not people. They were property. If you had become pregnant and you didn't want your child, you could just walk them down to the corner by the garbage, and that would be fine. And just like putting your garbage out today, you know how people will come by and maybe pick up something that you put out at the corner? People would do that with kids, and those kids would then be sold into slavery or done with whatever that person wanted. Because children, even as they got older, a parent, a father specifically, could sell their children into slavery. Because children and babies were not people, they were property. And you might say, well, that stuff is all horrible, but the Romans did have their own concepts of what was good, and what they uplifted as valuable was honor. And honor being not your concern for your neighbor, but honor being that I receive honor and praise for how well I've done at moving up the ladder and making a name for myself. They valued bravery, being able to overcome your enemies in battle. and they revered loyalty, specifically loyalty to the state. Rome was a very multicultural empire, and they had no problems with freedom of religion, all the different religions you want, believe whatever you want, treat your neighbor however you want, but don't cross Rome. As long as you pay your taxes, you're fine. Loyalty to the state was of utmost importance. Now, where did the thinking of all this actually come from? Paul says in Romans, "For although they knew God through nature, they could see the majesty of the Creator, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to become wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So what does this mean? What does this have to do with Rome? Paul is explaining how Rome came to see what they saw as good and bad. There's an old phrase in Latin that I'm going to share with you, which has been in the church since pretty much the beginning of Christianity. It goes like this: lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. As we worship, so we believe, so we live. Of course, slaves would be seen as normative because the gods had slaves. Of course, children would be seen as property because children and babies did not matter to the gods. Of course, bravery and loyalty to the state is of utmost importance because of the deification of Caesar and Augustus as the sons of God or of the gods. And so because what they worshipped was not the good that we see today, their gods did not care about equality or justice or any of the things that we take for granted today, freedom. The people also didn't. They believed in the things that their gods and goddesses espoused in the temples, and so they lived as such. So what changed? Why do we think of good and evil in such different ways than the Romans did? It's all because of Jesus. Everything that we take for granted as good in our Western culture is directly tied to Jesus Christ. There is nothing that we consider good that does not have roots in Jesus. Because Jesus made lives matter. Lives did not matter in the ancient world, and in much of the world that is without Jesus, lives do not matter. Not in the way that we cherish them in the West. In Matthew 19, it says, "Then children were brought to Jesus that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people," that was very Roman, "for bringing this property to bother the teacher. But Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me.'" I highlighted that word because I wanted you to look at it closely. This doesn't mean a 5 or 6-year-old. It actually means infant. The translation of little children means infant or newborn. "Let the newborn come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God, of heaven." First of all, babies and children matter to Jesus. The reason why we care about children is because of Jesus. When people would leave their children out in the garbage dump, and keep in mind, Jesus was crucified at the garbage dump of Jerusalem, Golgotha, and it's there in those locations where babies would be left to die or taken away. Christians would come and rescue those babies and raise them as their own children, would raise them in a Christian household. Prior to Jesus Christ, we can do excavations of these old cities, and where the garbage dump was, there would be hundreds of bones of discarded babies. After Christianity, that disappeared. Because babies and children matter to Jesus. Now, in our modern day, we have things that we argue about. And one of them is about the access to abortion. Now, I'm not here to condemn anybody. The women that have to who find themselves in that place of having to make a choice to abort their child deserve love and care, because it's a horrible situation to be in. But the pro-life movement is ingrained in the DNA of Christianity, going back to Jesus and why children matter to him. Because it's about caring and loving for the most vulnerable in society, and there's no one more vulnerable than an unborn child. So that's why the pro-life movement has always been predominantly Christian and started by Christians. In Matthew 8, 2-3, it says, "And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, if you will, you can make me clean.' And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I will be clean.' And immediately his leprosy was cleansed." Sick people and outcasts matter to Jesus. Has anyone ever seen this new technology? It's really cool. It's called a hospital. Anyone seen one of those before? There's always been healers in the history of humanity. But with Jesus, hospitals and the founding of hospitals for the weakest among us to receive care is a uniquely Christian creation. Hospitals and places of education can owe their beginnings and their thriving in the West to Christianity. Because sick people and people on the edges of society, not the powerful, but the weak, the ones who are suffering, matter to Jesus. Radical way of thinking. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." People of all races and cultures matter to Jesus. The default setting, as I mentioned, with slavery was also my tribe against your tribe. This is the way the world has always functioned until Jesus. Because in Jesus we discover that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that he gave this form, humanity, which is made in the image of God, the privilege of being deified through the Son. And that means that all of us, as Scripture states, are made in the image of God and therefore have inherent value in God's eyes. And that's what Jesus taught. One of the biggest ideologies of the 20th century that had such a profound impact on where we are today was the rise and the spreading of Nazism after World War I into World War II. Nazism, regardless of the German church's culpability in its standard, was a complete rejection of Christianity. Because Nazism taught that the weak deserve to be done away with because they're taking away important resources from the strong. And so the undesired, the lesser races, whatever that term means, the people that are not considered valuable are to be done away with to make room for the greater. It is only the strong survived. It is might make right, is the rule of the world without Jesus. And so Nazism was a rejection of Christianity and wanting to return to Rome, Roman imperialism. That's what the word Reich means. The Third Reich meant the third column or the third coming of Rome. Okay? Now, Christianity stands in antithesis to that, just as it stands in antithesis to slavery. Racism, slavery, subjugation of the weak, all of those things are evil and are resisted because of Jesus Christ, and only because of Jesus Christ. You might say, well, that's all good, but what about the bad guys? How are we supposed to treat even our enemies? I have a movie clip from a very famous book that has become a very famous movie about a very famous hero as the world sees it, and he acts in a way that we see as admirable. I want to see if you can catch what he does.
We can't leave them! He's joking, right? If we die for them, Harry, I'm gonna kill you!
So this is from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And if you know the story, Harry Potter has a bully and an enemy named Draco Malfoy. Draco and his buddies are actually trying to harm, if not kill, Harry and his buddies. And as Harry and his friends are getting ready to escape, Harry stops and sees that Draco is in danger of dying, of death, and so he's like, we need to save him. And so all of us would be like, well, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that can happen. But when we see someone that we would consider a hero going back and saving their enemy, that is an admirable thing. Why do we think that way? That's not how the Romans thought. That's not how much of the world thinks. But in the West, we see this behavior as admirable, saving your enemy. Guess what? This comes from Jesus too. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends his rain on the just and the unjust. God is not defining people by how bad they are to you. See, God shows his love to all people. But it goes on even further, because enemies matter to Jesus. In Romans chapter 5, we discover who the enemies actually are. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. Jesus' concern is for you. And you and I, being sinners, wanting to have things our own way, wanting to be our own gods and decide what is right and good and wonderful and what is bad and evil based on our own terms, are shown to be enemies of God by our sinful nature. And yet Jesus dies for you and for me. He dies in our place, on our behalf, in order to reconcile us and make us children of God, saved by him. See, Jesus loves, welcomes, and cares for all people, and he taught his followers to do the same. The reason why we value what we value is because of Jesus dying on the cross. You know, the cross was a symbol of the power of Rome. And up until Jesus, it was a sign of the subjugation of Rome's enemies, because slaves and the conquered would be put up on a stake, crucified in a multitude of ways. They were very creative about this, but they wanted to make it very clear that the enemies of Rome are to be ridiculed and mocked, and their shame is shown before them as they're stripped naked and stuck up on a pole for as long as it takes for them to expire. Could be hours, could be days, could be weeks. And they're powerless before the power of Rome. Jesus, a peasant from a backwoods province, dies a slave's death. And because he is risen, the power of the subjugation of the old world is undone. And the promise of new life is given not to just the Jewish people, but to all people on account of Jesus. As Paul says, there is no longer slave or free, Jew or Gentile. For all are given infinite value in God's eyes because of Jesus Christ. The last thing I want to show you is a debate, a conversation between two historians. One of them you know very well. His name is Tom Holland. Anyone know Tom Holland? This is not Spider-Man. They speak British, so it might be a little hard to understand. But a question is raised by the other historian. Now, both historians interestingly, are atheists when this is given. Tom Holland ends up becoming a Christian, but that's a different story. At this time, he's also an atheist. Listen to his responses to the questions put forward by A.C. Grayling.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge?
Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are and essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are the property of all humanity.
Did you catch what he said? I know he's speaking British, it's a little hard to fathom it, but what he basically said is, everything that we value as good, everything in the West comes from Christianity. Even things that are not about, that we would easily see, like respecting differences between people, tolerating other religions, science itself, as we understand it, and all the technological advances we have today, comes directly out of Christianity. The secular state, liberalism, freedom of expression, human rights, all come back to this crazy notion that all humans are made in the image of God and therefore have intrinsic value and worth. Charity and care for the poor and the sick, all of it comes directly from Christianity. And so the question begins again, can't you not be good without God? The answer is an emphatic, no, you can't. Because as we worship, if we take Jesus away, and we'll just end up worshiping something else, even if it's our own self or our own ideals. But if you take away Jesus, you'll begin to change what you believe and ultimately change how you live your life. And we've seen this. I gave you the example of Nazism. There was more damage done in the 20th century than in all of human history prior, in the amount of deaths that were done because of an ideology. Forget any religion throughout history. Nazism alone, 6 million Jews were slaughtered, to say nothing about another maybe 5 million unwantables by the Nazis. That's 11 million from a non-Christian ideology where Jesus is taken out of the picture. But another great growth of an ideology in the 20th century was communism. And communism also removes Jesus from the conversation. Well, there's as many as 80 million people who were murdered under communist regimes in the 20th century. So make no mistake, without Jesus, we cannot be good. But because of Jesus, we can be claimed and given a new life that begins now by faith in him, because he did die the slave's death on a cross for you and for me in order to set us free from slavery in this world and eternal slavery to come to sin, death, and the devil. We are set free to be of the value and worth that God has made us to be. That's why God did it, because He loves you so much that He gave His only Son that you would know Him. And in knowing Him, you would be free. And you would be claimed as His own. And you would be good. Amen.